The survey vessel Gentle Inquiry had been traveling through the galaxy for 300 years. Its crew of Velthrani scientists had studied more than 12,000 intelligent species. They had seen creatures of crystal that sang to communicate. They had met beings of pure energy that lived inside stars. They had cataloged every type of life form they could imagine. But when they entered the Sol system and found humanity, everything they knew fell apart. The ship's main computer was the first to notice the problem. It tried to classify humans using the standard system that had worked for thousands of other species. The computer ran its tests. It checked the results. Then it ran the tests again. After the fifth attempt, it sent an error message to the captain. Captain Vethril read the message with growing confusion. The computer was reporting contradictions that should have been impossible. According to the data, humans were social creatures who formed deep bonds with each other. But they also spent most of their history killing each other in organized violence. They showed extreme empathy and would sacrifice their own lives for strangers. But they also showed cruelty that made the threat assessment system shut down completely. The captain called a meeting of his senior staff. They spent 3 days reviewing the data and came to the same conclusion. The standard classification system could not handle this species. They needed to send for an expert. Ambassador Kethwin arrived 6 months later. She was the Velthrani Collective's best xenopsychologist. She had solved classification puzzles that had stumped entire research teams. When she reviewed the preliminary data on humans, she understood why they had called her. The Velthrani had evolved on a world called Harmony. It was a perfect planet. The weather was always mild. Food grew everywhere. There were no dangerous animals. The Velthrani had developed their civilization slowly and peacefully over millions of years. They had never known war. They had never experienced famine. To them, suffering was simply a mistake that needed to be fixed. Kethwin traveled to Earth to study humans directly. She was assigned a cultural liaison named David Chun. He was a middle-aged man who worked as an archivist at a major university. He had kind eyes and spoke softly. When Kethwin told him she wanted to understand human nature, he smiled in a way she could not interpret. In her first week on Earth, Kethwin observed humans in their daily lives. She watched them go to work and raise their children and talk with their friends. They seemed pleasant enough. Ordinary, even. She began to wonder if the survey vessel had made some kind of mistake. Then she asked David to show her human art. He took her to a museum. The first painting she saw was of a mother holding a dead child. The colors were dark and heavy. The mother's face showed pain so deep that Kethwin felt her own chest tighten in response. She asked David what this image meant. He explained that humans created art about suffering. Not just occasionally, but constantly. Their greatest works were often their saddest. They wrote songs about loss. They told stories about tragedy. They painted pictures of death and grief and despair. Kethwin did not understand. Why would any species want to remember pain? Why would they create beautiful things about terrible experiences? On Harmony, unpleasant memories were treated by medical professionals. The Velthrani did not dwell on negative emotions. They moved past them as quickly as possible. David thought about her question for a long time. Then he said something that Kethwin would think about for the rest of her life. He said that humans did not just survive suffering. They used it. They took their worst experiences and turned them into something meaningful. A song about heartbreak could help someone else feel less alone. A story about war could teach the next generation to seek peace. A painting of grief could make the viewer appreciate what they still had. Suffering, David explained, was not just something that happened to humans. It was something they processed, something they learned from, something they transformed. Kethwin asked to see more. David took her to concert halls where she heard music that made her weep without understanding why. He showed her books written by people who had survived terrible things and found ways to describe their experiences in words that glowed with hard-won wisdom. He introduced her to comedians who made audiences laugh about death and disease and disaster. By the end of her first month on Earth, Kathleen realized that she had been asking the wrong question. She had been trying to understand how humans survived their suffering. The real question was how they had learned to make it useful. She requested access to the historical archives. David warned her to start with something gentle. He suggested she avoid the 20th century entirely. There were things in there, he said, that she might not be ready to see. Kathleen was a scientist. She had studied the psychology of thousands of species. She was certain she could handle anything the humans had to show her. She was wrong. The archives were waiting for her. Thousands of years of human history, carefully preserved. Every war, every plague, every famine, every act of cruelty that one human had ever committed against another. The Velthrani believed in forgetting pain. Humans believed in remembering it. Kathleen walked into the archives on a Monday morning. She would not emerge for 3 months. When she finally came out, she was not the same person who had gone in. She had seen what humans were made of. She had learned what suffering could create, and she was terrified. Kathleen spent 3 months in the human archives. She read about wars that killed millions. She studied famines that starved entire nations. She learned about diseases that swept across continents, leaving mountains of bodies behind. She saw photographs from camps where humans had systematically murdered other humans for reasons that made no logical sense. But the hardest part was not the suffering itself. The hardest part was what came after. Every disaster had survivors. And those survivors wrote down what they had experienced. They created art about it. They told stories. They built monuments so that no one would forget. Kathleen found poems written by prisoners waiting to die. She found songs composed by slaves working in fields. She found jokes told by soldiers in trenches, laughing at death because laughing was better than screaming. The Velthrani had no concept for this. On Harmony, trauma was treated and erased. Painful memories were removed by gentle medical procedures. No one was expected to carry such weight. The Velthrani believed that forgetting was kindness. Humans believed that forgetting was dangerous. When Kathleen finally emerged from the archives, David was waiting for her. He had brought tea and a sandwich. He did not ask her what she had seen. He simply sat with her in silence until she was ready to speak. She asked him one question. Why did humans preserve these terrible memories? Why did they teach their children about horrors that happened long before they were born? Any rational species would want to move past such things. Any sane civilization would choose to forget. David was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window at a world that seemed peaceful and ordinary. Children played in a park across the street. A woman walked her dog. An old man sat on a bench reading a newspaper. Then, David told Kathleen about his grandmother. She had survived a terrible war. She had lost her entire family. She had walked across a continent with nothing but the clothes on her back. When she finally reached safety, she was alone in a strange country where she did not speak the language. She could have chosen to forget. She could have buried her pain and never spoken of it again. Many people did exactly that. But David's grandmother made a different choice. She told her story. She told it to her children. She told it to her grandchildren. She made them promise to remember. David asked Kathleen if she knew why. She did not. David said it was because forgetting was how terrible things happened again. Humans had learned this lesson the hard way, over and over throughout their history. When one generation forgot the suffering of the last, they often repeated the same mistakes. Memory was not just a burden. Memory was a shield. Kathleen thought about this for many days. She began to see human behavior in a new light. Their museums were not just buildings full of old things. They were warnings. Their history books were not just records of the past. They were instruction manuals for survival. She wrote a report for the Velthrani Collective. It was the longest report she had ever written. She described humans as a species that had developed psychological immune systems against despair. They had evolved the ability to transform pain into meaning. They took their worst experiences and used them to build something stronger. She introduced concepts that had no Velthrani equivalent: resilience, the ability to recover from damage and become stronger than before; spite, the desire to survive simply because something wants you to fail; gallows humor, the strange practice of laughing at terrible things because laughter was a form of defiance. The collective's linguists flagged many of her translations as possible errors. Humans had a saying that they translated as, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." This seemed biologically impossible. Damage was damage. It weakened organisms. It did not strengthen them. Kethwin confirmed that the translation was correct. Humans had learned to use their suffering as fuel. They had developed entire philosophies around finding meaning in meaningless pain. They had created religions that promised redemption through hardship. They had built cultures that celebrated struggle as a path to growth. The Velthrani had spent millions of years trying to eliminate suffering from their existence. They had created a perfect world where no one ever had to experience pain. They thought this made them advanced. Now Kethwin wondered if it had made them weak. She ended her report with a warning. Humanity was not just another species to be cataloged and classified. They were something entirely new. They had taken the worst thing in the universe and turned it into a weapon. Not a weapon against others, but a weapon against despair itself. The collective received her report with great interest. They debated its implications for many years, but they did not truly understand what Kethwin was trying to tell them. They would not understand until the Hollow arrived, and by then it would almost be too late. The Hollow came without warning. They appeared at the edge of Velthrani space, like a dark cloud spreading across the stars. No one knew where they came from. No one knew what they truly were. They were not alive in any way the Velthrani understood. They were something else, something that had moved beyond flesh and blood into pure malevolent intelligence. The Hollow did not conquer worlds with armies. They did not burn cities or enslave populations. They did something far worse. They attacked the mind itself. When the Hollow arrived at a planet, they would begin broadcasting. The signal was not made of words or images. It was made of pure psychological poison. It crept into the thoughts of every sentient being it touched. It whispered that nothing mattered. It showed them the vastness of the universe and how small and meaningless their lives were within it. It proved, with cold and perfect logic, that existence was pointless. Civilizations did not fight back against the Hollow. They could not. By the time the broadcast began, the will to resist had already started to fade. People stopped going to work. They stopped caring for their children. They stopped dreaming about the future. One by one, they simply gave up. The Velthrani lost 11 colony worlds before they understood what was happening. They tried building shields against the broadcasts. They tried countersignals designed to boost morale. Nothing worked. The Hollow had spent millions of years perfecting their weapon. They knew every vulnerability of the sentient mind. They knew exactly how to make hope die. The collective developed only one effective strategy. They ran. When Hollow ships appeared in the system, the Velthrani evacuated. They abandoned their homes, their history, their dead. They fled to new worlds and prayed the Hollow would not follow. It was not living. It was surviving. And even that would not last forever. Then the Hollow entered the Sol system. The Volthrani sent their warnings immediately. They transmitted evacuation protocols. They offered transport ships for anyone who wanted to leave. They sent their condolences for the death of human civilization. Humanity did not respond the way they expected. The first human ships to approach the Hollow did not flee. They did not attack. They watched. They recorded. They studied the broadcasts that had broken 100 species, and they analyzed them, like scientists examining a new disease. Kethwin was still on Earth when this happened. She watched human researchers work day and night, taking apart the Hollow's weapon piece by piece. They brought in psychologists and philosophers and artists. They held meetings where people argued about the meaning of despair and the nature of hope. She asked David what they were doing. He smiled in that strange way she still could not fully interpret. He said they were doing what humans always did. They were learning. The Hollow had designed their broadcasts based on their observations of other species. They had cataloged every form of despair and built their weapon accordingly. But they had never encountered humans before. They did not know that humans had been fighting this same battle for their entire existence. Human history was full of moments when hope should have died. Plagues that killed half the population. Wars that destroyed entire nations. Tyrants who tried to exterminate whole peoples. Each time, something in humanity refused to surrender. They did not know why they kept going. They just did. The researchers identified the key weakness in the Hollow's approach. The broadcasts were designed to create despair, but they assumed that despair would lead to surrender. For most species, this was true. But humans had developed something else. They had developed the ability to feel despair and keep fighting anyway. They called it spite. The military leaders did not understand at first. How could spite be a weapon? Kethwin tried to explain. Spite was the desire to survive simply because something wanted you dead. It was the refusal to give up even when giving up made logical sense. It was the voice inside that said no when every rational argument said yes. Humans had cultivated spite for thousands of years. Their heroes were not people who had lived easy lives. Their heroes were people who had suffered terribly and refused to break. Their stories celebrated the stubborn and the defiant. Their songs praised those who kept walking even when they could not see the path. The counter-broadcast project began 6 months after first contact with the Hollow. Human psychologists designed new signals based on everything they knew about resilience and hope. But the real weapons were simpler than that. They broadcast their stories. They sent out tailies of people who had survived impossible odds. They transmitted music written in the darkest hours of human history. They shared the voices of survivors who had looked into the void and found reasons to keep living. David was one of many volunteers who recorded messages. He talked about his grandmother. He talked about the war she had survived and the family she had built from nothing. He talked about the long chain of suffering and persistence that had led to him sitting in that recording booth, speaking to enemies who had never known what it meant to endure. The Hollow had never encountered anything like it. Their broadcasts created despair, but the human counter-broadcasts transformed despair into defiance. For the first time in their existence, the Hollow faced prey that fought back on their own battlefield. The war against the Hollow lasted 30 years. It was not like any war that had come before. There were few battles in the traditional sense. No armies clashed on distant planets. No fleets exchanged fire in the darkness between stars. This war was fought in the mind, and its weapons were stories. The Hollow tried to adapt. They analyzed the human counter-broadcasts and designed new attacks. They created despair signals specifically targeted at human psychology. They learned about human fears and human weaknesses and human trauma. They thought they could break humanity the same way they had broken so many others. They were wrong. Every time the Hollow found a new vulnerability, Humans found a new strength. When the broadcasts targeted loneliness, humans responded with stories of community. When they targeted failure, humans shared tales of people who had failed 1,000 times and succeeded on the 1,001st. When they targeted death, humans spoke of legacy and memory and the way love outlasted the body. The Velthrani watched this war with growing amazement. They had spent millions of years building a civilization based on avoiding suffering. Humans had spent thousands of years learning to use it. The difference was becoming clear that Ambassador Kethwin traveled with the human fleet. She documented everything she saw. She watched volunteers record their stories before going into battle. She listened to veterans share their memories of survival. She saw humans cry and laugh and rage against the darkness, sometimes all at the same time. David Chun was among the first wave of volunteers. He was not a soldier. He was still just an alchemist. But he understood something that warriors did not. He understood that this war would be won with words. He spent years traveling to hollow-affected worlds. He would land on planets where the population had already begun to succumb. He would find the survivors and sit with them and talk. He told them about his grandmother. He told them about Earth. He told them that despair was not the end. It was just another thing to survive. Not everyone could be saved. Some species had simply never developed the tools humans had. Their minds were not built to withstand the Hollow's assault. But many others found something in the human broadcasts that helped them hold on. They learned that despair could be fought. They learned that hope was a choice you made every day, over and over, even when making it felt impossible. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a retreat. The Hollow pulled back from human space. They stopped their advance into Velthrani territory. They disappeared into the depths of the galaxy, where no one could follow. No one knew why they left. Perhaps they decided humans were not worth the effort. Perhaps they found easier prey elsewhere. Perhaps they had never encountered anything that could hurt them before and did not know how to respond. Or perhaps, for the first time in their ancient existence, the Hollow felt something they had never felt before. Perhaps they felt fear. Kethwin returned to the collective to deliver her final report. She stood before the council and tried to explain what she had witnessed. She told them that humans were not special because they were strong or smart or advanced. They were special because they had learned to make suffering useful. She proposed a new classification. The old systems were not adequate for humanity. They needed a new category entirely. She called it Omega-tier adaptive. It meant a species that could take any pressure and transform it into fuel for growth. It meant a species that could not be broken because breaking was just another form of change. The council approved her recommendation. Humanity became the first species to receive this classification. There had never been anything like them before. There might never be anything like them again. David Chun was an old man when the war ended. He had spent decades traveling and talking and telling stories. His hair was white and his joints ached, and he was very, very tired. A journalist came to interview him about the war. She asked him how it felt to be part of the species that had saved the galaxy. She expected him to say something grand, something heroic, but David just shook his head. He said it did not feel special at all. It felt like doing what humans had always done. It felt like getting up in the morning when getting up was hard. It felt like taking another step when your legs wanted to stop. It felt like refusing to quit for no reason, except that quitting was not an option. He looked up at the night sky. It was crowded now with ships from 100 different worlds. Species that had been saved by human stubbornness. Civilizations that had learned to find hope in their own darkness. Somewhere out there, the Hollow were still waiting. Perhaps they would return someday. Perhaps they would try again, but David was not afraid. Humanity had faced worse than the Hollow. They had faced themselves. They had faced their own capacity for cruelty and destruction and despair. And they had survived. They would survive this too. Not because they were special, not because they were chosen, but because surviving was what they did, Dodd. It was what they had always done. The journalist asked if he had any final words for her audience. David thought about his grandmother. He thought about all the people who had refused to give up throughout human history. He thought about the long chain of persistence that stretched back to the first humans who had walked out of Africa and into an unknown world. He smiled. Then he said the only thing that mattered, Dodd. We kept going.